Welcome to the Story 516 podcast, where we sit down with Christians from across denominations and talk about how God is at work in the world today and inspire you to see God at work in your own life in new ways. Welcome back to the Story 516 podcast. My name is Zach, and I am joined again by a multiple time return guest, Jared. Yeah, 3 or 4. Maybe I should just bring you on as a co-host here. I brought you in today to talk about a musical that we both saw recently. We saw they filmed the version while the original Broadway cast was doing the play on Broadway, and we saw it in theaters, Hadestown. It just had its kind of little mini theatrical run this kind of towards the end of July in 2026. So there will be spoilers for an ancient Greek myth, basically. I looked it up, and it kind of covers the kind of a blend of the myths of Hades and Persephone, and then also Orpheus and Eurydice, two separate stories that they kind of combined and paralleled with each other. But after seeing the play, I kind of left me like there are a lot of really strong like Christian themes within the context of this play. So I figured we could start by giving a very brief recap of it, just in case there are people out there who haven't seen it or haven't read it and want to have that context. So the context of the play Hadestown, it's kind of set in kind of a retelling of an ancient myth. So you have Hades, who's the king of the underworld, and kind of the context for the setting is he fell in love with Persephone, another god, and every kind of like winter Persephone will go down to Hadestown and spend the winter, like the fall and winter, with Hades, and then return for spring. So Persephone kind of represents that life, and along with her return, the crops bloom, she brings summer. But then our main characters are Orpheus and Eurydice, two humans who are on Earth, and they fall in love, and through, I don't know, hard times, Eurydice ends up getting tempted to go to Hadestown to, I think it's portrayed as like, so she can fill her belly, have food, not worry about the fickle nature of seasons. And then the bulk of the play is Orpheus traveling down to the underworld to bring her back. And we might get into more spoilers, but I think that's a good context for starting off the discussion. So Jared, I'm curious, kind of just with the topic of like Christian themes in this story, I have certain things that I saw, like love, like trust or hope. I'm just curious, where would you like us to jump off into this discussion at?
Yeah, so I'd say one of the first things to think about as a Christian is two of the greatest storytellers who are Christians that a lot of people think about that are, at least within the last few hundred years, would be Tolkien and Lewis. And one of the things Lewis said, even though I'm greatly paraphrasing, is Lewis and Tolkien were both huge fans of mythology, ancient stories, people telling stories that have resonated and have survived throughout the centuries. And so I think it's important to know that Lewis said something akin to the fact of Christianity is essentially the story that all stories pull from. So when we're looking at Hadestown specifically, there's tons of different themes that you could focus on because it's a very dense thematic musical. I suppose one of the first things that I think about when I think about the story is there's a clear contrast between a lot of the different characters. So you have the contrast of Hades, and you have the contrast of Orpheus. Now it's important, again, as a Christian watching the story, to understand that Hades does not equal Satan. A lot of times people think Hades and they think Satan. That's kind of a common misnomer that a lot of times we'll fall into because we, obviously impart our Christian understanding and theology of the underworld being hell. and all those various things. But Hades in the show is just more of a god of death. Death is a natural process, and he's almost more of a businessman or a bureaucrat. But the contrast, as I was getting to, between Orpheus and Hades is that Hades is a man who's been in a relationship with a woman for many, many, many years, but their love has kind of grown cold and stale, even though he's able to provide for her and give her the material things that she wants. She doesn't feel that passion or spark. On the flip side, Orpheus is very young. He's very he's not good at providing for Persephone or for Eurydice, I mean to say. But he does have that passion there. He's able to sing. He's able to kind of get her attention, and he's able to woo her. And I think one of the things, if you want to kind of tie it into our relationship with God, if you want to make it more direct, even though obviously you could think about this if you have a girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever the case may be, how as love ages, sometimes you get problems later, is a lot of times people who get into relationships with Jesus right away, it's the kind of honeymoon romance phase right away. You're kind of swooning. You're kind of like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. I got to know God, and now I'm learning about how God works in your life and how he's active. And a lot of times you'll see a lot of young Christians who are very, very passionate. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing that they're passionate. It's actually very normal. Again, comparing it to a marriage relationship or a relationship between a man and a woman, the very same thing typically happens to most people. They get into a new relationship. It's exciting. It's fun. It's invigorating. There's so much that you could explore that's just there in front of you. It's great. But what tends to happen in all relationships, this is psychologically normal, is that as you stay in a relationship longer, that same type of passion, I guess you would say, kind of transforms into more of a companionship. It transforms, if it goes in a healthy direction, it kind of transforms more into a long-lasting bond where it's not that you're giddy, you don't get the butterflies as much, but you have a hard time imagining your life without that person because you've had so much shared experience. Well, to bring this to Hadestown, the interesting thing and the comparison in it is that the character Orpheus, who's the young man, is very naive about the realities of what it'll take to be in a relationship, how he has to provide for his spouse. Hades, the old man, he's kind of the passion, the exciting butterflies moment, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of over. It's kind of done with. And unfortunately, with him and his wife, they're trying to kind of rekindle that, trying to understand again how that feels and trying to reignite the romance. And so what you actually see is you see an old relationship and a young relationship, and you actually see the pitfalls, the upsides, but then the pitfalls of both. The downside of the young relationship, again, you can look at this in a marriage relationship or with a relationship with Christ, that'd be biblical. But the pitfalls of a young relationship is it's not very well grounded, and it's very naive. It hasn't been battle tested yet in a lot of ways. And it's all a lot of times based on initial feelings, or can be if you're not careful. The pitfalls of an old relationship is you can become jaded. You can kind of be like, well, I know what to expect. We've kind of done this dance a million times before. And so we're just kind of going through the motions and just kind of existing. But we're not actually in any way, shape, or form sparking that love that we once had and bringing that spark into the experience as well. So that's one thing, if we want to talk about that I think is you can definitely compare to both the relationship between a man and a woman and your personal relationship to Christ.
Yeah, no, I found that love was a very kind of stark theme where you do get a lot of those parallels. I hadn't thought about it of like a new versus old, or young versus seasoned relationship. So that's really cool. The other thing about love is like that he's willing to go to the underworld to pursue, that Orpheus is willing to go to the underworld to pursue Eurydice. And I mean, like, that's very like willing to go to kind of where she is to save her. Very biblical, I think. I mean, at the end of the play, spoilers again, he is able to bring her out, but there's a condition applied to it where she has to follow him on this dangerous path out of Hadestown and back to kind of the land of the living. But Orpheus can't turn around. So he has to trust she'll be following him. So he has to trust both Hades' word, trust that she is following him. And I mean, it's really unique in the play where the fates, so if you're familiar with like ancient myth, there are these fates who kind of like weave people's fates or will often maybe be a narrator for kind of an omniscient view of what's happening. And they're kind of like expressing these doubts to Orpheus as he's traveling. And kind of the big spoiler, the big twist at the end is he ends up turning around and seeing her. And because of that kind of break in trust, she is condemned to remain in Hades forever, and he can't succeed in his mission of bringing her out. So I thought it was really interesting with this trust. And I don't fully know where to like take this thought, but it was such a stark theme. And I think sometimes with stories, it's okay if the theme isn't like explicitly like, here's a Christian message. I think if it's an interesting theme that provokes conversation, I think that's equally as valuable. Because being able to leave a play, movie, book, song, and engage in conversations about a really interesting theme with some friends, I think that can be just as valuable as having like the gospel presented to you through that play, movie, book, song. So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts, Jared, on kind of the theme of trust, how you see that in the play itself, or just how you would kind of where that thought and that thread takes you.
Yeah. Well, it's hard again. It's hard to get away from the marriage analogy. Again, it's used a lot in the Bible, so I don't have a problem with doing it here. But it's extremely clear that in the story with the condition that's made, Hades basically has Orpheus walk through the darkness, but he can't look back at Eurydice, and if he does, then she's lost to Hades forever. Well, the interesting thing with a lot of ancient stories, because you just don't get this in as many modern, I should say, in as many modern stories. But even if you want to look at something like Lord of the Rings, and Lord of the Rings at the end, Frodo doesn't stand at Mount Doom. He doesn't, through his sheer willpower and the goodness within him, overthrow the ring and put it into Mount Doom and it gets destroyed, right? Tolkien was very aware of the fact that human nature is flawed. And the ring was supposed to basically represent the greatest amount of temptation you could endure. And so Tolkien's making the claim that not even a more pure-natured person like the hobbits and Frodo can even overcome this ultimately, even though they might resist it more than others. But it's kind of evil that destroys evil in that instance. Well, what's interesting in this story, even though, again, it's coming from a Greek context, is that Orpheus is portrayed throughout the story as this great hero who inspires people, who believes that they can overcome their nature, and that everybody can persevere through sheer willpower and through belief, right? Well, what's interesting in the story is that it's a tragedy. And at the end, Orpheus does doubt himself in the darkness and does end up looking back in a moment of weakness. And one of the things I find interesting about that is it almost seems to allude to this idea, a very Christian, very Jewish idea, that even though we might have heroes, those heroes are still flawed. That even though they might overcome evil or overcome certain failings at times, they still themselves are not perfect and they still aren't the ideal hero, like, or the perfect hero, I should say, the archetypal hero. So you think about Moses obviously overcoming a lot with the Egyptians, but Moses also having various flaws. You can think about King David in the Old Testament as well, overcoming a lot, but still having other flaws that he had to overcome. And the reason I bring this up is because I think that the story of Hadestown is willing to acknowledge the fact that while we as human beings try to persevere and kind of push toward the good, ultimately nobody, even the best of heroes and the mightiest singer of songs, is able to ultimately overcome their fear of losing that relationship, their fear of lack of trust. And so to more directly tie it to what you were talking about with our relationship with God, I would say it just shows the fact that doubt is deeply human, that we all are going to have doubts. Jesus had doubt at the Garden of Gethsemane. But then we often, those doubts will cause us to act upon them in ways, obviously in various ways that can be harmful or can hurt our relationships. That is not to say that we ought to lose faith or because we doubt or because we act on it at times, because Jesus is always there opening up his hand, ready to accept us again. But it is to acknowledge and to be honest about the fact that to be human is to make mistakes and to fall short of the ideal amount of trust. Even great marital relationships that last decades and both people die together happy always have their rough spots. And so it's just to acknowledge that human beings are flawed and that when it comes to trust, there will always be times where we do lose that, but we just have to regain it again.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was even thinking with both kind of the points on like the love and then the trust, you can kind of see the gospel there in a way where in a similar fashion to like Hades and Persephone and their love kind of, I don't know, I'm viewing it with like you have Earth and you have Hades. So you have the two locations where the lover, like Orpheus, comes down to Hades to try and bring his beloved back up. And it's like, well, that's the gospel. Jesus came down to earth to bring us to heaven. But then instead of where Orpheus failed the test of trust in that sense, Jesus didn't. We fail it on our side, but then Jesus kind of even overcomes our failing. So the gospel is like a more perfect rendition of this. Yeah, so those are some of our thoughts on the musical Hadestown. If you're able to see it in person, that would be amazing. If you're able to catch a recording of it, I don't know when those will be available for streaming or anything, or go back and read the actual myth. I think you'll find a lot of those imagery and symbolism and themes that could provoke really great conversations. So we'll catch you next time. Thank you for joining us. You can support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/story516. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.